Have you ever had your baby feeding choices questioned? Did you have to be a squeaky wheel when it came to advocating for feeding your baby in the way you knew was right? My guest, Lindsay, fell headfirst into parenthood with preemie twins who needed NICU care. She learned how to feed those babies and was excited to have an easy time with a singleton when she discovered she was pregnant with twins again. Hear this double twin baby feeding story that has so much to offer anyone who has ever wanted to feed babies with the milk from their own body. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
All right, so my name is Lindsay Castiglione. I am a mom of two sets of twins. So I have a now 9-year-old boy-girl set, Madeline and Noah, and then I have an 11-year-old identical boy set, Hayden and Connor. So we are a Navy family. My husband, Charlie, he is a submariner. So we have lived in 11 different houses in the 13 years we've been married. Much of that moving around was with little kids. So it's been a wild ride. But through my experiences with breastfeeding each of those sets, which were both very different experiences, I ended up finding a passion for lactation. And so I went through the long journey of becoming an IBCLC. Once my youngest were about 2, I started that. And then I opened my practice about a year ago, and I concentrate on twin families. Of course, I'll see singletons as well, but I see twin families all over the world. It's nice for them to have a lactation consultant that has walked through that experience. So it's just the best job in the world. I love it. And yeah, I'm excited to share about my stories.
Yes, that's amazing. So much of your story is unique and interesting. Not only the fact that you have not one, but 2 sets of twins that you have fed with your own body, but the fact that you're a military family that has moved around so much, that brings its own unique challenges to birthing and taking care of babies. And then also then that you became a lactation supporter and now do that for other people. What I would love to know before we get into your actual baby feeding stories is, what was your exposure to breastfeeding before it was your turn?
So I had known that my mom had breastfed my sister and myself, obviously. And I'll just preface this. I'll use the term breastfeeding because I know it refers to my mom, who identified as those being her breasts. And I do the same with myself when I talk about my story. So that aside, I had known she was proud to have breastfed both of us, but I really did not see a whole lot in person. I guess my sister has older kids than mine, so I saw a little bit with her, but it is definitely something that's a condition of our society now, right? Is that we don't see a whole lot of breastfeeding go on, and definitely not breastfeeding twins. I had a limited amount of experience, I'll say that. I planned to breastfeed, and I read, there's a wonderful book by Karen Kirchhoff-Brumada that was endorsed by La Leche League. It's called Mothering Multiples. She wrote this awesome book, and that was like my Bible. So I had planned to breastfeed. As a first-time mom, I was not sure how it was going to work.
So you did not have tons of exposure. It was something that had been done in your family, but you had not seen it up close and personal. Did you know other parents of twins?
No, I had no real interactions, and we had such a complicated pregnancy, which I'll tell you the story about, but that first set of twins, it was so complicated that at 16 weeks, they got diagnosed with something called twin-to-twin transfusion. So they shared a placenta, but they did not share it equally, which can create lots of issues that are risky. And so we really didn't know if they were going to make it from then until they were born and they were healthy. So I was very hesitant to reach out to other twin families, to do much of anything socially, because I was just very nervous and I wasn't sure how this was going to turn out. So I didn't, looking back, I would have definitely reached out more and made some connections, because that is a really important part of twin parenthood, is knowing other people who are going through that too.
Yeah, and that can definitely impact getting a diagnosis like that early on, can impact how you feel about your pregnancy and how you go into the birthing experience, and that can impact lactation. Wow. Yeah. Tell us then what happens at the delivery, and particularly focusing on anything that happened at the delivery that would have impacted lactation.
Yeah. So we had a diagnosis at 16 weeks and 4 days. And then we were followed really closely by our MFM. We went to twice a week ultrasounds. We also drove to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. We were living in upstate New York at the time. And we drove there to be evaluated by the fetal surgery team. So they were going to do a placental ablation where they actually will cauterize the blood connections between the babies so that they each have their own blood flow. Having surgery when you're pregnant is not on anyone's list of things they want to do, but it can be life-saving. So we drove there twice, and each time they said, oh, you definitely have this syndrome, but it's just not quite bad enough. They wanted it to get a little bit worse before they did surgery, which was like really difficult at the time. But we ended up stabilizing a bit, like as we got to like viability, which was amazing. And so by 30 weeks, we were hitting a stride and still going twice a week to the MFM. But we had all of a sudden, we had what's called a reversal with twin-to-twin transfusion. So one baby usually has so much fluid in their amniotic sac, and the other baby has barely any. And I went in for a regular monitoring appointment, and all of a sudden it was switched. So one baby who didn't have any before had too much, and vice versa. And the baby who had too much fluid now, his heart was really struggling with trying to process all the additional blood flow and everything that was going on. And they admitted me. I was inpatient for a few days, but he just kept having these like really low decels where his heart rate would drop way down and it would stay low. So they said, you know what, we made it to 30 weeks and 3 days. That's the day I delivered. Enough is enough. Let's get these babies out safely. So that's what we did. We had a very emergency C-section, like one of those movie type scenes where everyone's running around prepping the OR. And I had known from reading Mothering Multiples that it was important, if you were going to have NICU babies, to pump as soon as you could following the C-section. I'd also read that, and this was so helpful, that you will sometimes hear postpartum nurses tell you, just sleep tonight, get that rest. You just had a C-section, your babies are in the NICU, get a 4-hour stretch. You don't need to be pumping every 2 or 3 hours, that type of thing, which may be well and good for a singleton. But I know now even more so, that we need to put in that request, right, for a twin milk supply. So we have to be so careful about getting that stimulation. So following the delivery, I had gotten a pump bedside by, I believe it was 60 minutes following getting into the postpartum room. And I had hooked myself all up and I was starting to do the pumping. I had a little bit of lactation help. It's tough in hospitals. You kind of get what you get. You don't get upset. So I had some help with that, and I started just pumping every 2 hours during the day, and I did 3 hours overnight. And I was lucky to get a decent amount of colostrum. I had no idea about hand expression at the time. Now, again, hindsight, I would have done more hand expression to collect that colostrum, but luckily I was able to get a good amount with the pump. So they would bring it down to the NICU and syringe feed it to the babies. And as soon as I could get down there to start doing some of that myself, I could. So it did take about, I want to say it was about 8 hours before I even got to see them face to face after the C-section. So that was tough, but all things
Wow.
considered, with how scary the pregnancy was, like they were here at 30 weeks. I knew statistically they have a good prognosis at that point. And yeah, so they were here, and I knew all these goals that I had around breastfeeding, but I still didn't really know if it was going to work. And I had this amazing NICU nurse who like took me under her wing, and she was like, if this is what you want to do, I can help you. I can walk you through this. And so
Wow.
she literally changed my life. And I was able to bring in a really good supply, pumping around the clock. We had our NICU was about 45 minutes from our house. So it was an intense time. They were there for 7 weeks.
Wow. So you were using the multi-user pump at the hospital, the Medela
Yeah.
Symphony, or
Yep. I had rented
okay.
one. I had gotten one right off the bat, the Medela Symphony, Medela. So I had gotten that, and I had that at home, but when I was at the NICU, I would pump there with their
Okay.
pump. So
Okay.
I didn't have to bring the pump back and forth, but I would
Mhm.
go into the NICU every morning with my lunchbox full of milk to bring them. And yeah, so they were tube fed from the beginning, as most
Through the
preemies are.
nose.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yep. And so we started with kangaroo care slash skin to skin. That's really in the NICU, from my experience then and now professionally, is where breastfeeding starts. So we do all this wonderful skin to skin, which helps them grow. And then we were looking for readiness signs, like when they would nuzzle the breast, when they would get close, when they would maybe lick the nipple. So the first thing we did was they would have me pump completely to empty, quote unquote, and then latch the babies and see where we would go. So they still wanted to make sure they could verify their intake through the nasal tube, but they would let them practice latching. And so we started with that when they were 33 weeks. So I have this awesome picture, which I'll send you, of me tandem nursing them when they were about 3 pounds each. And
Mm.
so I had the lactation consultant at the hospital. She would come in and see me. I would just be that squeaky wheel, and I would ask her like every couple of days to come in and help me with the feeding. And she was great. And so the NICU is never a place we want to be, but it definitely helped set me up for success, that I really could take my time working up to nursing them more and more, and then also getting my milk supply up and having support. We For full term babies, they go home and you don't have people that are all around you that are able to help. So that was a really nice part of it.
Yeah, and do you feel like in the NICU they were providing you evidence-based information and that the babies were receiving evidence-based care when it comes to lactation care?
That's an awesome question. Yeah. So sometimes they were, and then there were definitely a portion of care providers that had more antiquated, I would say, ideas. You're going to tire the babies out. You're trying to nurse them too much. They're burning more calories than they're getting. All of those things, which now I'm like, no, that's not evidence based. But then I had others that were great, and there was also some pushback. And this is super common with NICUs, about bottles. They really wanted me to give them the bottles, get them to make their goals for intake, and then get them home and then worry about breastfeeding. I got that speech several times from different nurses that were there. But I advocated for myself, and this other nurse that had taken me under her wing, she was really like supportive as well. So it was nice to have her back up. But I had little signs on their incubators that said, please don't give me a bottle. I'm learning how to breastfeed. They each had one. And so we didn't do a bottle with them until week before discharge, because that was one of the check boxes they had to fill, was they had to use a bottle for a full feeding before they were discharged. So I would nurse them when I was there, and I was there for about 10 hours a day, sometimes more. And then when I was home, they would have the NG tube. But I did get pushback from that because they're like, why are you having these 35-week babies having NG tubes? They did not like that. They wanted to just give them a bottle. So there were some that it was a mixed bag, I would say, with the care.
Yeah. And how were you able to maintain your own strength in knowing that what you were doing was the right thing for your baby around all
Yeah.
these white coats? I'm experts, but not experts in breastfeeding
Absolutely.
and in milk supply.
I think it was a combination of the nurse that was really helping me advocate for myself because I was worried about being that mom. Like I felt like they were just thinking, oh, she's just difficult. Like she's has to have things this way and it's easier for us to do it a different way. Or maybe they thought I didn't know what I was doing because I was a first time mom. I'm not really sure, but she gave me that backup to know, nope, this is the right path for you. You be strong. You're your baby's advocate. So that was really helpful. And also what I had read through that Mothering Multiples book, I knew that, no, this is the best setup for me. Sure, I can give them all bottles and get them home and then work on breastfeeding, but that's not going to give us the best chance of success. And I would rather them be here for a few extra days and get like this knowledge base between the three of us than just skip ahead for the sake of time and then worry about it afterwards, which can work for some. I've seen it happen where they do just do bottles and get home and breastfeeding works out great and they're latching and it's all wonderful. But I've also seen many where that's not the case. So I'm glad I stuck to my guns on it.
Why do parents of babies in the NICU who want to feed human milk to their children have to fight so hard to do so? With so much research available about the benefits of kangaroo care, of nursing directly from the body, of the impacts that human milk has on the baby, it is clear that these families benefit from providing their milk to their babies. Yet I hear so frequently on this podcast and from my clients that they are made to feel like troublemakers when they seek to provide evidence-based care to their babies in the NICU. This is a barrier. While I am so thankful that NICUs exist and so many families receive amazing care from these amazing teams, it does not excuse their lack of knowledge about the research regarding human milk feeding. It is time for NICUs across the country to catch up to the available research regarding human milk and preterm babies. If you are confused about what you are being told by your baby's care providers, whether they are in the NICU or not, and you would like a lactation expert on your side to guide you as you make decisions that will ease your anxiety, ensure your baby is fed, and protect your milk supply, I would love to be that person for you. You can find my info at www.quabbinbirthservices.com, linked in the show notes, as always.
So anyway, I took them home triple feeding because that's what you do in the NICU, because they have these exorbitant amounts of milk the babies are supposed to be taking. So we would be doing weighted feeds, and I can't remember the amount, but like they wanted these 37-week gestationally babies to be taking like 105 mLs at every feeding. Honestly, I was so ingrained with that mentality that I know now that I overfed those babies for their entire first year.
But it wasn't your fault. That's what you were being told to do.
Yeah, you're so focused on that growth in the NICU, and they need to be feeding them a certain amount in one aspect because of scheduling. I know, again, I guess it's just logistics, but they can't have babies feeding on demand at all hours of the day and time because they have like shifts and like schedules in the NICU for nursing for staff. So that's one reason why they're fed every 3 hours, from what I've been told, is that it's just to simplify logistics.
We have to be doing things in hospitals that are best for babies.
I know. We never got the chance to feed on demand when they were there at all. So they were discharged triple feeding. No direction to me on how to not do that anymore. Just one day they'll just start refusing the bottle of supplement following. And then you'll know it's time to stop triple feeding. And I was terrified. I tried to talk them into letting me take a scale home so that I could continue weighted feedings. And they said, no, you just have to trust your body. And I'm like, what do you mean trust my body? Like, you've been telling me exactly how many milliliters. Like, it was just very anxiety inducing, especially for a first time mom. I definitely had undiagnosed postpartum anxiety for sure, which I'll get into a bit when I get to the second set. But I was able to get them latching, I would say 90% of the time by about 1 month home, like after 4 weeks of being home. One thing that they were big on, and they still do this in NICUs, is the NeoSure aspect. They really want those babies to get the NeoSure twice a day, or however many times a day your pediatrician says, or your neonatologist. But I didn't give them straight NeoSure, but I did fortify my milk with it because I had all this milk. I'm like, why? I'm not going to make them formula when I can be giving them my milk. So we did do 2 bottles a day with that forever moving forward. But the rest of the feeds, I had them latching. And I also didn't tandem feed them exclusively right from the get-go. And this is something that I teach with all my classes and with my clients. I think there's such a focus on tandem feeding for twins that it's not really attainable for new moms, especially first-time moms, to just right out of the gate be tandem feeding for every single feeding. It's very challenging. With one baby, you are latching them and then they come unlatched, right? And then you latch them again, and it's like this back and forth. So when you're trying to tandem feed newborns, you are constantly going back and forth between them. And it's really actually difficult for their intake to be adequate, for them to be getting enough milk when they're spending kind of half their time waiting for you to help their twin before they can get relatched. So it's a tricky process and just a learning curve. So I did 1 or 2 sessions a day of tandem. The rest of them, I just individually fed them back to back. And then gradually, as I got my feet underneath me, I would take another individual feeding and I would switch it over for a tandem feeding. And I just chipped away at it until, like I said, like about a month in, I was tandem feeding about 90% of the time. And so that's what I tend to encourage with the families I work with. Of course, if they tandem feed and it's like amazing and wonderful and babies are gaining, and then great, we're going to go with that because obviously it's time saving and there's benefits to it. But more often than not, I see it being a process that we have to work up to.
Yeah, that's great to take the pressure off so that people know I can build up to this slowly. It doesn't have to look like the ideal. It can look like however it needs to look like for my family in this moment.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
How did you manage nighttime when you weren't feeding tandem?
This is another interesting part of the whole tandem versus individual feedings. I never tandem fed either set overnight, which is so surprising to a lot of people because they're like, why wouldn't you? You want to save time so you can sleep more. But in the beginning days, it felt like they got less milk overall. So I felt like I was just waking up more frequently to feed them. And then once they became more efficient, I really enjoyed that overnight one-on-one feeding time with them. It was like our time. And so they were pretty cooperative with staggering. So I would just feed one baby and then I would go to wake up the second baby, whoever wasn't the squeaky wheel, as I call them. But in the very beginning, when I first brought the first set home, my husband, so I mentioned he's in the Navy, he was working rotating shifts. So every month, 7 nights straight, I was on my own overnight without any help.
Okay.
So that was intense. What I did do during that time was I pumped and I bottle fed them overnight, even though I was by myself and I should have just nursed them, but I was just nervous and I figured if I pump and I bottle feed them, I know how much they're getting. So then I know I can get a certain amount of time before the next feeding. And so that's just what worked for us then. Not what I did with the second set, but for the first.
Okay, so you would pump and bottle feed, and you would wake one up, feed them, get them back in bed, wake the second one up, feed them. And they generally would tend to stay asleep until the next feeding?
Yeah. Yeah. They were giving me a break. But from beginning to end, when they were newborns, it would take me about an hour and a half to do everything, to feed one, to feed the next, to change diapers, re-swaddle. And then you have you got to go to sleep as quick as you possibly can. And you have maybe an hour before they wake up again. So it was literally like sleep an hour, up for 2 hours, sleep an hour, up for 2 hours.
Oh my gosh, that's a lot.
Yeah, super exhausting.
And would you sleep during the day with them as well when they would sleep? Or
not really a napper. I missed out on that gene, but no, I didn't really nap a whole lot with them. If I really needed it, maybe I could squeeze it in, but it was just a lot of months of sleep deprivation in the beginning. And they were pretty good sleepers. I would say they were sleeping through the night on their own without sleep training by about 6 months. So that's decent.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
My 5-year-old still doesn't sleep through the night.
Yeah, that's a whole other story. Once they were like age 3, they started waking up every single night, and that continued until like 3rd grade. Side note.
Yeah, she's going through a fearful stage.
Yeah, or I can't sleep. You have to close your eyes.
Okay, so you just managed. You just did your best to manage how you could. Yeah.
I did, and I was so focused on meeting my goal. So my goal originally was 1 year. And when they were born so early, I adjusted that. So it had to be a year from their original due date. And I was so focused on that. Things were going along pretty well. They were like starting solid foods at 6 months. And then at about 8 months, they each started going through nursing strikes, and they just were so stubborn. They just would not nurse. And I would get nervous about dehydration and calories. So I would end up bottle feeding them. And then it would get better. And then they would come, because I read, it's so true, if it's before 12 months, it's a nursing strike. It's not weaning, which I think a lot of people get confused about. And I would eventually get them back, but it started to just be, it wore on me a lot to be going back and forth like that. And I would be pumping for one and nursing the other. And so at about 9 months old, I decided I'm just going to switch to exclusively pumping for them. And so I did at that point. And then I pumped until they were 14 and a half months old, because literally the last day I pumped was on their original due date a year later. So I was eyes on the prize. Yes. Yep, I did. And then we were also at that point looking at doing another round of IVF to have a sibling. So our plan was we were going to have one more baby. We really wanted to know what like a boring 40-week pregnancy would be like. But IVF is complicated. I won't get into all the details, but when we went in on the day of embryo transfer, where they put the embryos back inside your uterus, they said, oh gosh, they're really not looking great quality wise. So the plan had been to transfer one, and they said, really, we would put 2 back if you really want a good shot at a singleton. So that's what we did. And they became Madeline and Noah. And I found out very early, being with IVF, I think I was 5 weeks, and they saw the 2 sacks. So before we even saw 2 heartbeats, and my boys at home were 18 months old, and I was so overwhelmed. I was like, I actually fell into a bit of a depression at that point, because one, I knew how much work twins were. I did not have ignorance as bliss at that point to fall back on. And it was just really overwhelming. And I had wanted to know what having one boring pregnancy was like. And I was so worried, knowing the NICU stay and the complications, that we were going to have some sort of a similar outcome with that said. And then what would I do with my older boys? I couldn't be at the NICU all day. So I was really worried about all of that. But once we found out they were a boy and a girl, and it really wasn't about genders because I assumed I would have all boys, but it was something about that kind of made it click for me that
This
I
is
was going to
different.
do this. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was going to be okay. I bonded more to them at that point. And at 30 weeks, I started like thinking, okay, I guess they're going to come any day now. But
Oh,
they had
wow.
0 complications. Our only complication was that my son was large for gestational age as a twin on the singleton scale. He was 8 pounds 2 ounces at birth,
Wow.
and my daughter was 6'11". But they were an intended VBAC, so I was really, this was going to be my only shot at another delivery. And even if it was going to be twins, I was like, I want to have a vaginal delivery with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a doula, and I was doing all the reading and the researching, and my daughter was baby A, and she was breech 95% of the pregnancy. And we would do spinning babies, and I was doing all sorts of like inversions and in the pool all the time. And I would get her to flip, but then 24 hours she would flip back. And she was also smaller, which when you're delivering twins, it's not always like a contraindication depending on your provider, but for many, they say, nope, we want the bigger baby to be baby A. And anyway, so we ended up having a repeat C-section, which was really a bummer, but it ended up being fine, all things considered. I was lucky to have a decent recovery, and I was able to be nursing and this is so mind-blowing now to think back on it. I was nursing a set of twins, and I had 2-year-olds, so they're 25 months apart. And my husband at the time was going through a commissioning program with the Navy, so he was in college full-time, and we literally planned the birth around his finals schedule, and he was back at school full-time 5 days after delivery.
Oh my
So
God.
yeah, it was wild. I hung on for dear life, but we made it through that.
You made it
Uh,
through somehow.
we went through some bumps in the road with feeding them. It wasn't like simple, which when is
Mm-hmm.
it ever? I don't know. Maybe sometimes. But let's see, my daughter had a mild tongue tie and a really lip tie. And all the classic signs, like I had creased nipples and some pain, luckily not too much. So we were making it through, but she had slow waking. She also would have these epic spit ups, like projectile, because she was getting so much air when she was nursing. But I think one thing that really helped was that my son was such a tank that he was really reinforcing my supply. And so he made up for whatever shortcomings she had. But our pediatrician at the time was like very anti-revision. He's like, nope, she'll grow out of it. She'll be fine, which she was, but it was definitely bumpy. So we went through that. And then, I don't know, I did the same thing with the tandem feeding with them. I nursed them one at a time, except for once a day. And then I gradually worked up to tandem feeding them too. But they never had a drop of supplement, which is like I'm very fortunate to be able to say that. It's not that common with twins that we see that. Usually there's some sort of, and lots of times it's because of them being preterm, of twins being preterm.
Right.
That we do see some sort of a supplementation situation, but they were born at 38 and 2, again, giant babies. And so we were really fortunate in that aspect. But they nursed till they were 27 months old. And I actually weaned them so I could do my CLC, so my certified lactation counselor training, in a different city. So weaned them so I could go away for a week.
Yeah. And what were the messages that you were getting from providers, from nurses, from your OBGYN? Because sometimes there's an undertone of doubt that gets planted from providers, especially when somebody has twins. Like they want to kind of tamper your expectations a little bit when it comes to feeding twins, or because you had already done it once, did they not feel the need to do that so much?
I think that was the case more so with the
Okay.
second set, is they were like,
Mhm.
oh, she's done this before. Like, she's a professional, which I wasn't. I was still learning too. And it was a totally different experience. But
Mm.
they definitely trusted me. They trusted me more. But I got that a lot the first time around, like from the pediatrician, and just how many minutes are they nursing every time? And I had to be a certain amount of minutes and arbitrary stuff. But they were growing fine, so they didn't really have a whole lot to complain about. I think if they weren't, then maybe that'd be a different story. But yeah, they
Yeah.
trusted me, I would say.
Okay. That's good. Yeah, sometimes you hear that people want to kind of lower a person's expectations about feeding their babies and just create a plan B before they've even
Oh
tried,
yeah,
which
yeah,
can plant a seed of doubt and make them not trust their body's capabilities.
absolutely. And I think with just if you're having one baby, the people around you tend to their trauma. I shouldn't laugh; it's not funny, but they're into the way that they discuss with you about your upcoming arrival. Don't,
Right.
I had to do this, and don't think that you're going to make all the milk that you need. You might have to use formula. And anyway, yeah, they will do that with one baby, but when it's two, oh my gosh, like everyone's Aunt Sally and cousin Joe, they want to tell you that they didn't make enough milk for one baby. Why do you think you can make enough milk for two babies? All the naysaying, it's intense,
Yeah,
especially.
so what are your responses to those people or what were they at the time when you were feeding babies? How did you respond to people who were telling you their horror stories about not being able to feed their babies?
I I think I just was like, we'll see how it goes. That type of
Mhm.
nonchalant attitude. And I had thankfully done enough research on my own at that point, with even with the first set, that I knew how milk supply worked. When people would
Mm.
say, I woke up on 3 months postpartum and my milk was gone, stuff like that.
Mm.
And I knew, I'm like, no, I don't think that's exactly how it works. I was able to expect, and I think now that I'm thinking about it, there is a section too in Mothering Multiples where she does talk about that, about people giving you like a negative outlook. And maybe just you can go two ways. You can just not share with people about your goals, or you can just share almost excessively to try to like just make it clear to everyone, like, this is my goal. I'm going to work towards it. And basically, if you don't want to support me, then we don't have to talk about it, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and you decide for yourself what's the best way to go about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no right way for any person. And that's whether you're having twins or a singleton. You don't have to discuss how you're going to feed your baby with anybody. And I see people encountering this problem once their baby surpasses 6 months or 1 year or two
Oh,
years. They start to get pushback from family members. And if you want to advocate for toddler feeding, great, do that. But if you don't want to and you just want to feed your baby and not have to talk about it, great, do that. It's up to each of us to decide the level of comfort we have in discussing what we're doing with our families. And
absolutely.
you don't have to talk about it with anybody. And that includes your mother in law, your cousin, your brother, your friends, the mom group.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I did find a lot of people would ask, and I think they, like, about strangers would ask me if I was breastfeeding, like out in public.
Mm,
But they also, I think people feel emboldened to ask questions about twins in general. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And the way we feed our babies is so emotional. Whether or not someone is breastfeeding, there might be some scars there. If
100.
somebody answers yes or if somebody answers no, regardless, there's a story.
Yes, absolutely. And like
And
trauma sometimes, and
yeah,
grief.
and even if someone says no, there could be a lot of grief there There could be sadness over lost experience. They might be afraid of your judgment.
Mm-hmm.
If they say yes, they might be afraid of your judgment. Regardless of how you're coming to that conversation, there's going to be fear in how we answer the question.
Yeah.
And you and I are lactation supporters, and I don't ask people that question. I just
don't either. And I
Yeah.
think for some of the twin families that I work with, it's almost tricky about sharing my own experiences with them because I don't want them to feel like that's my standard.
Mhm.
When I get into it with people talking about my background, I feel very fortunate. I think on social media a few months ago, there was something coming around about if luck had something to do with breastfeeding. And there's a lot of people that feel very strongly that it wasn't luck, it was hard work. I did this it didn't just happen to me. But I feel like I was extremely blessed, lucky, fortunate, privileged, whatever you may want to call it. But I had a partner that was supportive. I had a roof over my head. I had food to eat. I had lactation support. I had healthcare. I had all these things to help me get through my journeys. The stars aligned. That's the way I think of it. My body cooperated. So I don't want clients or families that I work with to think that that's my standard because I am very well aware that's not always the case. And we can't always have all that line up, unfortunately. And I think we intertwine feeding our babies with how we define motherhood.
Yeah.
This is really apparent when we're weaning too. If we've spent a lot of time nursing and then we're weaning, it's like, how do I soothe my child? How do I mother them if I'm not nursing them? But if people have this expectation of going to only feed them my milk and that's going to work out great, and then things don't go that way, they think they failed as a mother, and it like breaks my heart.
It has been so amazing to hear your stories. I'm sure there are going to be twin parents or expecting twin parents who listen to this, or even somebody who is not a twin parent who thinks, I need to reach out to her. So where can people find you if they would like to get lactation support?
Yeah, I would love that. I see families, like I've mentioned before, all over the world. So I do telehealth visits. A lot of times I'll have families who have a local IBCLC that may help them with latching and weighted feeds. And then I will do virtual sessions with them to work on like the twin specific stuff, like timing and strategies and tandem feeding and all that. So my website is fullheartscollaborative.com. I got my business name because everyone says, oh, you have your hands full constantly, right? Which most moms hear, but especially twin moms. And so the response is, but my heart is so full, right? You should see my heart. So that's where Full Hearts came from.
Aww.
So I have all sorts of information on my website about that. And I also do twin and triplet specific prenatal classes. So I do breastfeeding twins. I do expecting twins, which is a more general purpose class. And I also do breastfeeding twins for the experienced parents. So sometimes I have parents come to me that they had solid feeding experience behind them with one baby, but they're not quite sure how that's going to translate. So I do a more concise, targeted class just for them. And I also do a newborn twins feeding workshop, which is meant for anywhere in the first 16 weeks or so for families who want help making a feeding plan. They may not need a lactation consultation, but they need help focusing in on their goals and strategies to reach them. So I do all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, that's great. And it's an inclusive class. Anybody
absolutely
wants to feed human milk to their babies.
Yes. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I have delved into TikTok, which I feel like a dinosaur using. I'm not doing any sorts of crazy tricks and dances or anything, but I'm trying to be out there on social media. So you can find me on all of those platforms too.
Awesome. We'll link everything in the show notes so people can find you. Thank you so much for sharing your two stories. This has been something that will encourage so many people.
Good. Thank you. This has been great.
Whether or not you have fed twins, so many of us can relate to so much of what Lindsay described in her stories. From a scary diagnosis in pregnancy, to having preemies, to a long NICU stay, to getting unwanted questions about her babies. These stories are so relatable. Please share this episode with someone who could use some baby feeding compassion and encouragement. And while you're at it, you can enter my holiday contest. Join the Milk Making Minutes community on Facebook to see the details of the contest. I'll have the post pinned. You can win a virtual lactation consultation with me for yourself or to gift to someone else. I'll see you there. Hey, Charlie, what do you think about a mom who has fed 2 sets of twins from her own body? What do you have to say about that?
That is one busy mom.
Yeah, no kidding.